All right. Yes,
Yeah.
good. So I start the story with his trip to South America when he was a young man, and he'd I'll sort of fill backfill some of his earlier life, but this is him, age 17, and he is about to set off for South America, which is to prove hugely formative, a massive experience for him, and one that really shaped him for the rest of his life, I believe. Um, he sailed from Liverpool just short of his 18th birthday on a ship called the SS Patagonia, which you can see. Actually, I found this picture of it, this watercolor of it on the internet, and this is it sailing into Rio, where he would have stopped on his way down to Montevideo. And from Montevideo, he went on up country, up the River Paraná to the area that you can see on the map called Mesopotamia, which is Entre Rios, between the rivers Uruguay and Paraná, fertile area of kind of ranching country in northern Argentina. And he was going out there to work with a couple of Scottish brothers, Ogilvy from Ogilvy family from Angus, who were running an estancia in that part of the world. His mother had fixed him up with this job, um, and on the way out, he began to suspect that all might not be quite as he had hoped, because his one of the brothers was traveling back with him, and it was pretty apparent that he drank an awful lot. Um, they arrived in Montevideo, went up to Entre Rios, went to the estancia, and all Robert's fears were immediately confirmed when he discovered that both brothers were raging alcoholics, and the place was in a state of ruin. And further to that, Argentina at that moment was in grip, A, of a severe drought, and B, an absolutely brutal civil war, which was largely being waged by um, opposing factions of gauchos. So he turned 18 on the ship. So he was just 18 when he landed in this very volatile situation. And he had to think on his feet, and he had to perfect his Spanish. He had a Spanish grandmother, so the Spanish language was kind of there, but not. He'd never really had much opportunity to practice it. He had ridden quite a bit, and of course, his life during the time he then spent in Argentina was spent entirely in the saddle because it was the only way to get around. Um, he wrote back, he wrote home, nothing but grass and sky and grass, and then still more grass and still more sky. For months, the revolution had been going on, the rival bands roaming about and stealing horses, slaughtering the cattle, and now and then, if they could catch a man or two alone, cutting their throats just as they cut a sheep's, driving the knife in at the point with the edge outwards and bending back the head. So he was having a real baptism of fire, this 18-year-old, and he was witnessing all sorts of violence, which I think marked him, and great danger, which he actually took to. He was very adventurous. He was the gauchos with whom he was spending time. I mean, there's a myth that he was a gaucho. Of course, he wasn't a gaucho because, first of all, there was no money in being a gaucho. And the reason he'd gone out there in the first place was to try and restore the family fortune because his father had gone mad, basically, and had spent all the money. Um, and also, the gauchos at that time were ethnically distinct. They were mixed race European and Guarani Indian, and they kind of lived beyond the law. They were itinerant stockmen, and they were very quick with their knives. They lived a very brutal existence. They lived entirely off the cattle, which they herded and they ate. They made their clothes out of the hides. They even sat on the cattle skulls. So he did live with them and he rode with them, but he didn't act, strictly speaking, become a gaucho. However, he did like I think he quite liked dressing up, and he was someone who was very always very conscious of his appearance. Um, and this is an early evidence of that. So this is him photographed in a gaucho outfit, aged just 18. So during he was in Argentina from 1870 to about 1878. For those 8 years, he was there for 6 of those 8 years, and 3 separate trips. So the first trip, the Ogilvy ranch proved to be a ruin. He rattled around doing various things, going on various adventures, but certainly didn't manage to make any money, and came home after about a year. The second time he went back, this was about 3 years later. He got a concession from someone in London, a commission from someone in London to try and get a concession to grow mate, which is that astringent green tea that they drink in that part of the world. And you can see the gourd, the mate, which is also called the mate, that they drink it out of, with a silver rim and a silver drinking straw, which is sealed but perforated, so you get the liquid without getting all the bits of leaf up in it. So he set off to see if he could find some places where he might be able to get a concession to grow mate, and he went to Paraguay for this end. That's a picture of him, which is in later life. Again, you can see that he's good at having his photograph taken, and I thought he was smoking a pipe in that photo, but actually he's drinking from a mate. Again, it's the mate straw that he's got in his mouth, and I think that he wouldn't have looked out of place in the Magnificent Seven. He looks like a gunslinger there. But his time in Paraguay was fascinating, and very dangerous again, because when he arrived, there had been, within the last 18 months, an incredibly brutal civil war, a war rather, with three of Paraguay's neighbors, with Argentina, Brazil, and Bolivia, had simultaneously been the dictator of Paraguay, who was called Lopez, had taken on his three neighboring countries. And of course, in the end, it was an absolute catastrophe for Paraguay. So when he arrived there were virtually no men left because they'd all been killed, which meant that there was a proliferation of wild animals. And you were quite likely on horseback, riding out into the interior of the country to come across jaguars, which he frequently did. It was very dangerous. He didn't have any joy with the mate concession, but he did come across several of these abandoned Jesuit missions, which was where the Jesuits in the 18th century, until they were expelled, had taken in the local Indians. And Robert believed, I think quite unfashionably, that they had actually done a great service to the local Indians by looking after them and by bringing them in to work and live in these missions, when otherwise they would have been exploited and oppressed by the other European colonizers. He later wrote a book called A Vanished Arcadia about that experience, about the Jesuits in Paraguay, which was one of the sources for the film The Mission, which you probably remember, with Jeremy Irons and Robert De Niro. A marvelous film. But he didn't find any mate to grow, or it was impossible in that country at that time to have any real successful commercial exploits. So yet again, he failed to make he failed to win back the family fortune. So he had one more go, which was to buy horses in Uruguay and drive them up to Brazil, where he thought that he could sell them at a great profit to the Brazilian army. And that failed. He managed to buy lots of horses in Uruguay, but very soon discovered that they didn't swim very well, a lot of them, so they drowned, they died of snake bite. And eventually he got to a point in the journey where there was, he learned that there was an area of impenetrable forest between him and Rio de Janeiro, on the other side of which was pasture, which had some property that poisoned the horses. So that expedition also was a commercial failure. So he had, by that stage, he'd been in Argentina for about 6 years, all told, living on his wits, living in the saddle, living with these very wild, lawless stockmen, herders, the gauchos, and a lot of the time putting himself in considerable danger, I think. So I think he became very physically courageous at that during that period. But he made no money, which had been the object of the exercise. He did, however, from that time, he got the cattle brand, which the Gauchos gave him, which was it had belonged to a previous dictator of Argentina, another Gaucho, and the Gauchos that he had ridden with said, "Here, you have this, but you've got to make it your own." So he put a circle around the stem of this existing cattle brand, and it became his personal brand mark throughout his life. He used it on the fly leaves of his books. He used it in his letters. He used it everywhere. So it was a very early example of, I suppose, what you'd call branding. Um, and he came back, of course, with a tremendous treasury of stories, of experiences, which he would later write about. He didn't realize at the time that he was even storing them up, and he didn't think that he had any ability as a writer. Who was he? He was my mother's great uncle, and so my great great uncle. He died when she was 8, and she did meet him. Um, she met him not very often, but she met him as a little girl, and he impressed her tremendously. And when I finally came to get interested in him, which wasn't until I was in my 60s, she had already begun to get dementia. So, as is so often the case in families, I didn't ask the right questions at the right time. And I did, shortly before she died, ask her what she remembered of him, and she said he was very brisk and rather bouncy. And you can kind of imagine that this vastly energetic man who probably preferred horses to most humans might have appeared perhaps a little terrifying to a small girl, but he did make an enormous impression on her. They would have met at this house, Ardach, which is on the Clyde between Dumbarton and Cardross, which was the house that he retired to in later life to write. And he had inherited it from an earlier Robert Cunninghame Graham, who had been a politician and had proposed a Bill of Rights in the late 18th century, who was known as Doughty Deeds because of a poem that he'd written, who built this house when he came back from Jamaica, where I'm ashamed to say he had been an inspector of taxes and had made a lot of money and had inevitably kept slaves. I remember the house very well because I used to go there as a child. That was the entrance hall, and off to the right, past the portrait, there was the book room, which was the little room where he wrote. And when I was a child, it was still full of the books that he would have had in the house. And there was a bust of him on a table, and the sort of his presence was still there. I mean, it was kind of it lingered like cigar smoke, even though my grandparents had the house by then for probably 30 years. He died in 1936, and my grandfather was his heir because he had no children. So they moved up to that house on his death in 1936. The books in the bookroom would most likely have come from Gartmore, which was the Graham family home, and that sits above the Lake of Menteith, up at the west end of the Castle of Stirling. In his day, it didn't have the extra story because it was bought eventually by the Kaiser family, who were the clan. I think it was the clan shipping line. And as shipbuilders, they had the skills to put another story on an already rather large house. So that's where he spent quite a lot of his childhood. But I was learning about him really from my mother, who I mean, he was a sort of idealized male role model for her. Her father was in the Navy and was away a lot when she was a child. She'd met Robert. He'd impressed her enormously by giving her a tip when they'd been to visit and they were leaving. And he gave her brother 5 shillings or something, and then he turned to her and gave her half a crown, which was absolutely unheard of in those days. Little boys got tips, but little girls definitely didn't, and it was entirely characteristic of him that he would have done such a thing. So she adored him, and with very good reason. I mean, he was dashingly handsome. He was aristocratic. He was adventurous. He was a champion of underdogs. He was an espouser of lost causes. He was a politician, a writer, a horseman, a traveller, and he was admired everywhere he went. He was painted by Lavery. You've probably seen that wonderful full-length portrait, which is in the Kelvin Grove Gallery in Glasgow. He was sculpted by Epstein. He was caricatured by Spy, fictionalized by George Bernard Shaw. He was a friend of Oscar Wilde, G.K. Chesterton, acquaintance of Thomas Hardy, Wells, John Masefield, and most importantly, literary mentor to Joseph Conrad. The list goes on and on and on. And for me as a teenager, so did my mother. By the time I was about 15, I was absolutely sick to death of him, and I never really wanted to hear another word about him. She became his literary executor when my grandfather died and had those of his papers that hadn't already gone to the National Library. And she ended up writing her own book about him, Gaucho Laird. She was obviously born Jean Cunninghame Graham. And her book is a kind of semi-fictionalized biography. She had a lot of his papers. She had a lot of his correspondence, which means that his voice is very present in that book, which is a very nice thing about it. She quotes him a lot, so you hear him a lot. But when she didn't have access to the facts, she had absolutely no qualms at all about making things up. So there's quite a lot of there's quite a lot of imaginary material in the book, but it's a charming book, and it does give a good picture of him. She let go. By the time she let go, it was really, she had written her book. So we're talking about where her book came out in 2005. And by 2011, she was kind of starting to get dementia. And I had sort of vowed that I would never have anything to do with him. Left him entirely to her. You know, one Don Roberto worshipper in the family was quite enough. But after I've just found myself kind of being drawn into the vacuum. And by the time the referendum came along in 2014, I'd started to get really interested in him. And the more I found out about him, the more amazed I became, really. So I came to him 2014. I was 65 then. So I was very late coming to him, but I think that was, that's as it was. But it was also there were advantages to that, in that I could was able, I hope, to look at him fairly dispassionately. Joseph Conrad, who I'm sure you know, he kind of mentored. He read an article that Conrad had written in a journal, wrote to him, and said, "I think this is terrific." Met him. Realized that here was a fellow kind of adventurer, because Conrad had spent a very adventurous time before the mast in sailing ships. But they were incredibly different in character. Conrad was introverted and had a pretty bleak outlook on life, whereas Robert was very exuberant and mercurial and full of ideas and well, I think actually he was a realist also, but he wasn't a pessimist. They were very different. But Conrad wrote the quote that one hears everywhere about Robert. "When I think of you, I feel as though I have lived all my life in a dark hole without seeing or knowing anything." And that, coming from a man who'd had a fairly adventurous youth himself, was quite something. It's very difficult to say a life as large as Robert's in a short term. But just to give you a sense of where he came from, through his Graham ancestors, the Earls of Menteith, several authorities reckoned that he was a direct and legitimate descendant of Robert II, and therefore claimant to the Scottish throne, with as good a claim, and if not better, than anyone else alive. And I mean, for us as children, it was a sort of family joke that Robert should have been King of Scotland. I mean, we didn't take it at all seriously, but it was one of those stories that was told. And the English novelist Ford Madox Ford said that in later life, Robert was once told by an admirer, "You ought, Mr. Graham, to be the first president of a British republic." And Robert replied, "I ought, madam, if I had my rights, to be the king of this country. And what a 3 weeks that would be." Um, his father, Willie Bonteen, had been a cavalry officer who, in the 1840s, had been either hit on the head or fallen off his horse in a hunting accident in Ireland. Um, Whichever it was, the blow caused considerable problems for the whole family later on in life, including Robert. Um, his mother's father was a sailor in the sort of grand swashbuckling tradition of Horatio Hornblower or Jack Aubrey or one of those from those Patrick O'Brian novels, um, who married his bride, Robert's grandmother, when he was 42 as a visiting sailor in Cadiz. He'd put into port in Cadiz, and she was the daughter of an Italian Spanish merchant family, and she was 16. And I think he carried her away on his ship. Um, and their daughter, Anne Elizabeth, Robert's mother, was born on her father's flagship in the Caribbean in the 1820s. And that's her as a young woman. And it was through her that Robert got the sort of Hispanic, through her mother, through his grandmother, that Robert got that Hispanic sort of the gene that made him look as if he could have been a sitter for Velasquez. He was born in 1852 on Queen Victoria's birthday. He shared a birthday with the woman who he probably most disliked in the entire in the world, really, and who, as a symbol of imperialism, he came to absolutely detest. He used to refer to her as the Empress of Famine. Um, and he spent his childhood partly in the Isle of Wight, where his grandmother had moved with her second husband because the admiral had died in the flu epidemic in the 1840s. Um, so he spent time with her. He spent time in London. And he spent time at two houses in Scotland. First of all, Finlaston I never know whether it's the south or the west bank of the Clyde, south, I think, and Ardagh, and Gartmore eventually they moved to Gartmore in Stirlingshire when he was about 10. And that was the place that he loved most. And that was where he spent probably his teens. Um, he was sent to Harrow School when he was 13. He didn't like it very much. He later wrote that he found it snobbish. And he did okay there, but nothing very spectacular. But things weren't going at all well back at home. And his father's fall and the blow to the head had led him to become increasingly unpredictable and violent. And eventually he rushed at his wife with a sword. And she fortunately wasn't injured, but he was deemed to be a danger to his family, and he was removed to a rented house in Dumfriesshire, where he spent the next 16 years until he died. It's a very sad story, really. And So at that point, Gartmore they discovered that he had run up enormous debts, and Gartmore had to be let. The family had to move out. Robert was taken away from Harrow, sent to a tutor, first of all, in North London. And then when even that proved too costly, he was sent across to the embassy chaplain in Brussels, who offered tuition to the children of indigent gentlefolk. So he spent a little time there. But then by the time he was 17, he was ready to go to South America, and he spent the next 6 of the next 8 years. So when he eventually came back, and he came back when his father's health was sort of starting to deteriorate, he was about 28. And he wasted no time in finding himself a wife. The wife, who I don't know whether you know anything about the wife, but the wife's story is almost as extraordinary as his. She purported to be a half French, half Chilean actress called Gabriela de la Belmondiere, who Robert had met in Paris. Uh, and he turned up on his mother's doorstep with her having married her. And his mother was not at all pleased because she was hoping, obviously, that he would find some nice English or Scottish heiress who would solve all the family financial problems. And instead, he turned up with this rather elfin-looking, dark-haired young woman who spoke with a very strange accent, sort of half spoke French and Spanish and English with an odd accent, and had this rather exotic name. But in fact, as my mother discovered in the 1980s, she was a doctor's daughter from Yorkshire called Caroline or Carrie Horsfall. And the extraordinary thing about this is that she and Robert then lived that falsehood throughout her entire life. So Gabriella, who appears frequently in all the records of Robert's life between the ages of about 28 and into his 50s, was in fact Caroline Horsfall, the daughter of a doctor from Yorkshire who had run away from home. And I mean, her story is worth a whole talk all on its own. So I mean, don't have time to go into too much of it now, but it is extraordinary. She was that picture by a portraitist called Percy Jackham Hood actually isn't. She's been beautified in that portrait, and I don't terribly like it. And I think this photograph of her, taken as a young woman, is probably much more like who she was. She was very spirited. She was obviously very intelligent. She was a good linguist. She, in time, at Robert's side, when once he was in politics, became an activist with him. Became a socialist, spoke at lots of meetings, and also wrote her own book about Saint Teresa of Avila, the Spanish medieval mystic, who um, she developed a sort of penchant for and spent several years traveling around the remote interior of Spain um, with her long-suffering Galician maid, um, going to very remote places to find old convents and monasteries. And she eventually produced her book, which was called, yes, Saint Teresa of Avila, which the Spanish authorities promptly banned. It was massive. It was an 800-page, two-volume biography. And she proposed that Saint Teresa's visions were sexual in nature. And the Spanish authorities didn't take at all kindly to that and promptly banned the book. But they went on a very long honeymoon. They went to Texas and Mexico, and they got on a wagon train from San Antonio to Mexico City, um, which was extremely dangerous. So once they got over the border into northern Mexico, there was real and constant danger of attack by hostile Indians, bandits, and they circled the wagons every night and slept inside the circle, with weapons under their pillows. And it was on the trail that Gabriella developed the habit of smoking, which eventually killed her. So she took up smoking coarse black tobacco cigarettes to keep the insects away. Um, their marriage was quite unconventional. They spent a lot of time apart. They traveled a lot. She traveled to Spain. Robert was traveling all over the place, North Africa a lot. And But they always came back together to Gartmore, and they were, whatever went on in their individual lives, they remained the two people who were most important to one another. That's them sitting outside the house at Gartmore, with one of the dogs was a stray that they'd picked up on their travels in the States and Mexico. Luckily for Robert, Gabriella was a very good businesswoman, and here she is at the dining room in Gartmore doing the accounts with her maid Peregrina looking on. And she was able to at least keep the place afloat, because when his father Willie died, he left debts which would today's terms were about £12 million. I mean, absolutely astronomical, which they never had. They had no prospect at all of repaying. And Robert, meanwhile, was running up even further debt through his political activities. Um, So Gabriella managed at least to sort of keep the ship from sinking completely by importing stuff from Spain and selling it, and also by selling off the fuse at Gartmore. Um, and she died when she was only 46. She died of she had an underlying condition of diabetes, but I think it was the sort of smoking that actually did for her in the end. And she's buried alongside Robert, well, or rather, he is buried alongside her in the priory, in the nave of the priory on Inchmahome. Um, and the story goes that he dug her grave the night before she was interred, and sat at the graveside and smoked a final cigarette when before she was buried. Um, but that's jumping ahead. Going back 20 years. He's back from South America. He's newly married, and he's ready for politics. And there is the family tradition is they have been Whigs for generations, so radical lairds, I suppose you might describe them as. Um, and his forebear Robert Graham of Gartmore had been a politician and had proposed a Bill of Rights. So there was the tradition, the family tradition there waiting for him once he got back from South America, and he was. I think his sense of social justice had been ignited in South America. He'd seen a lot of things that had made him very conscious of the fact that there were a lot of oppressed people whose lives he earnestly desired to make better. And I mean, obviously, he couldn't in South America, but that had lodged deeply in him, and he had a fierce sense of indignation about the way that people he'd seen in South America were treated, and that very quickly translated into what he found when he got back to Britain, back to Scotland. Um, there were three things really going on at the time that he went into politics, that he started to consider standing for Parliament, which was we're talking about the mid 1880s. So it was the plight of the crofters, who effectively were serfs. The Crofting Commission was about to happen, but it hadn't yet. And that was the commission that recommended that they be given certain rights. Um, the plight of the tenantry in Ireland following the potato famine and the beginning of the political unrest there, and the protests against landlordism, which were beginning to gather pace, and the plight of the working men of the west of Scotland, whose working conditions, and as members of the Keir Hardie Society, you probably know a lot more about this than I do, but they were awful. I mean, they lived and worked in really dreadful conditions. And Robert saw all this once he got back, and it all fed into his desire to try and effect change. He was influenced by William Morris and socialism, and he became, once he actually was in London, he became a sort of peripheral part of the William Morris circle. And he knew Eleanor Marx and Edward Aveling and Anna Besant and all of those people he came to mix with. But he'd already read William Morris and was influenced by him, and also by Henry George, the American land campaigner who advocated a universal land tax. And the other person, of course, who became very, very important in his political life very early was Keir himself. So they met in 1886 when Robert had just been elected. He'd stood in 1885 for Northwest Lanarkshire and been defeated, and stood again the following year in 1886 and was elected. And Keir Hardie was he was the miner turned journalist. He was the editor of the Miner, and he was the agent for the Lanarkshire miners. And he started going around with Robert and taking him around the pits to meet his new constituents. And they very quickly developed a good friendship. Um, and it became evident to Keir Hardie that Robert was very effective in Parliament in speaking up for miners' rights, and in particular for the 8-hour working day. And for his part, Keir Hardie proposed the 8-hour working day at an annual miners' conference in Edinburgh, and used the pages of his own paper, The Miner, to applaud Robert's efforts. The other thing that they were both interested in, and it stemmed kind of from the recognition that land ownership is so closely and complexly related to equality in society, was home rule. And so in 1886, in Robert's first year in Parliament, they formed the Scottish Home Rule Association together. And then 2 years later, they formed the Scottish Labour Party, and I'm sure you've probably all got copies of this membership card number 1, I think, with Keir as secretary and Robert as president. And that year, Robert proposed Keir as the independent Labour candidate for Mid Lanarkshire, which was the first time he'd stood, and he came, as you know, he came last. But they were spending a lot of time together wherever they could. In 1889, yes, they'd formed. That's right. They'd formed the Scottish Labour Party by then. A year later, they were invited to go to the Bastille centenary celebrations together, and they heard calls for the 8-hour day to be made universal. And they also that year attended the TUC conference in Dundee, where it was that year, and argued for the unskilled workers to be admitted, although that motion wasn't successful, I don't think. In 1992, the general election where Robert stood as a Scottish Labour candidate in Glasgow, he lost his seat, and I think he was exhausted. His energy during that 6-year period was almost manic. I mean, it has been suggested that he might have been bipolar. I'm quite certain he wasn't, actually. But during that period of 6 years, he was everywhere at once. He was fighting on every front. Everything that roused his indignation, he went in and campaigned for. And I think after 6 years, he was utterly exhausted, and he fought a very peculiar. He behaved very strangely during the campaign in Glasgow, and upset practically everybody that he came into contact with, and duly lost. Well, rather didn't win. It was Camlachie was the seat, but Keir Hardie at that same election was elected to West Ham, West Ham South. So as Robert came out of politics, Keir Hardie entered it, and they remained in touch, and they remained, as far as I know, they remained close friends. And there's some evidence of that when Gabriella died in 1906, Keir Hardie wrote to Robert, "We have been through so much together, and in the days gone by have given so much to each other, that a feeling of kinship has grown up in my mind, which almost makes your grief mine." So there's a sense of affection and familiarity there. And I imagine that Keir Hardie wasn't a man who expressed those sort of feelings very often. So I think he must have been very moved by Gabriella's death and Robert's grief at her death. And in 1915, when Keir Hardie died, Robert described his Glasgow funeral in With the Northeast Wind, which was a sketch written as a sort of counterpart to With the Northwest Wind, which he wrote when William Morris died. And it's a somber piece. The mood is somber. I mean, you know, he died in 1916. The war was still 1915. The war was still in full flight, and the mood in the country was somber, I think. And he said that he saw Hardie as someone who was simple and yet with something of the prophet in his air, and something of the seer, effective yet ineffectual. And I think he may have been suggesting that Keir Hardie had failed in the main task, which was to persuade working men to take their destiny in their own hands. And in suggesting that, he may really have been levelling the same accusation at himself, because after his 6 years in Parliament, none of the things that he was fighting for had yet come to pass. And their thinking behind the 8-hour working day was that if the working man and woman had the leisure time, which they currently didn't have, because they worked terribly long hours, they would be able to educate themselves and thereby eventually achieve their own representation in Parliament. I mean, that was the thinking behind the 8-hour day. So that was very much a key ambition. But Robert's career, his parliamentary career, was pretty mercurial and pretty explosive. I mean, his election ticket in 1886 was Home Rule, abolition of the House of Lords, nationalisation of land and key industries, 8-hour working day, free school meals, and a number of other things. And when he was asked about Home Rule, he famously said, "I would rather see my taxes wasted in Edinburgh than in London." When he was asked about the House of Lords, he said, "Well, would you care to visit an hereditary dentist?" Which I think is a wonderful remark. He was very quick. He cut a great dash. This is a photograph of him later, but during his time in Parliament, he used to ride in Rotten Row, sometimes in full gaucho outfit. And I mean, he certainly turned heads. He was a marvelous horseman, and he had beautiful horses and a very fine seat, as they say, of riders. The parliamentary exploit that he's best known for is Bloody Sunday, the riot in Trafalgar Square in 1887, when he and John Burns, the trades unionist, led the charge against the police. What had happened was that there was a very hardline Metropolitan Police Commissioner called Sir Charles Warren, who wanted to make sure that there were no disturbances at the Lord Mayor's procession, which there had been the previous year. And there was trouble there was a lot of trouble in the East End of London, where wages were being cut and people were jobless, and there was a great deal of unemployment. And the unemployed used to come into Trafalgar Square every day to hear people like William Morris and Annie Besant and Robert speak about what they could do, you know, how they could be helped, and where they could get soup kitchens and that kind of thing. And Warren basically wanted to clear this dirty mob out of Trafalgar Square, so there was due to be a protest for Irish Home Rule and freedom of assembly, and he brought the police in and had the troops standing by as well, out of sight. And Robert and John Burns got involved in a sort of scuffle with the police, and Robert was knocked on the head, knocked unconscious, and dragged by the hair into the centre of the square. And John Burns was also rounded up, and they were taken to Bow Street Magistrates Court. And 6 weeks later, they were tried. And this is them at the trial. And they were convicted of, I can't remember what it was. There were two charges. One would have meant that they would have had hard labour. They were luckily convicted of the lesser charge, and they've spent 6 weeks in Pentonville, which was a very unpleasant experience. And Robert later wrote about it. And there was a political cartoonist called Tom Merry, who did this drawing of Robert when he came out. And you can see that even in his convict's uniform, he has his beard and his moustaches and his hair immaculately coiffed. And he has the right-hand cuff of his convict's jacket artfully turned up to show a little flash of the lining. So I think Tom Merry had got the measure of him. Um, After politics, he'd lost the Kamalaki contest, and he very quickly turned to writing. And to start with, he wrote polemical pieces in mainly left-wing political journals. Um, and a favorite target was the Empress of Famine herself, Queen Victoria, who he detested. And also, he wrote a great deal about and against empire and the way that the Englishman, in his imperial arrogance, treated the natives of whatever country it happened to be throughout the world. Um, but he was then quite quickly picked up by Frank Harris, who was an Irish American publisher with a real gift for for finding good writers and for marketing his magazine, The Saturday Review, which it was his aim to get it into every drawing room in England. And I think he probably did pretty well at that. So it was it was very widely read, and he was starting to assemble a stable of writers that included Robert H.G. Wells, G.B. Shaw, and others. And he picked up Robert and got Robert writing for him. And uh, George Bernard Shaw wrote later, he said, I was the Saturday reviewer in the theatre. Cunninghame Graham was the Saturday reviewer in the universe. So Robert was kind of given carte blanche to write whatever he liked. And he very quickly became really very well known as a writer, as a columnist, I suppose you would call it today. He wrote opinion pieces and more whimsical sketches in the Saturday Review. And he came to the attention of Edward Garnett, who was at that time, young editor, publisher's editor, who was on the lookout for new people to publish. And Edward Garnett was to become one of the major figures in the literary, the early 20th century literary world, editor to many famous people. And he had a particular affection for Robert. And so he published in 1895 Robert's first book, which was a sort of rather whimsical look at life in the Trossachs, but not from a tourist perspective, but more from a kind of wry, um, a wry take on Scotland through the ages, as seen through the area around the Lake of Menteith, which surprised everybody and got him quite a readership because it wasn't what people expected it to be. He went on to write 30 books over the next 30 years or so. And the most famous of his stories is one called Beatock for Moffat, um, which is about an old Cockney, an old Scotsman coming home on the train to die with his Cockney wife. He lived in London for a long time. He's coming back up north, and the story describes the train journey and how eventually he reaches Beatock, where they have to change trains to get to Moffat. And in case you haven't read it, I won't tell you what happens. But it's a wonderful story, and it's a very sympathetically told, but it's very unsentimental. And a lot of people consider it Robert's one of his finest stories. Um, so he spent the second half of his life really writing and continuing to travel. He had one more big adventure. He went to North Africa. North Africa became for him in the second half of his life what South America had been in his early years. He found it intriguing. He found it a place full of adventure. It was at the crossroads of Africa and Europe. In the towards the end of the 19th century, all the European powers were kind of vying for influence at the collapsing court of a very corrupt sultanate, which was about to collapse, and they were looking for control of the Straits of Gibraltar, apart from anything else. Um, so Robert found Morocco absolutely thrilling, and he used to go and stay with John Lavery, the portraitist, who by that time had become very wealthy and famous and had a house outside Tangier. And he decided that he would go to the city of the forbidden city of Taradand. It was forbidden not for religious reasons, but political reasons at that particular time. It was south of the Atlas. And to get there, he decided that he would dress himself up as an Arab, as a local sheikh. which he duly did, and he had two locals who were with him as guides. He didn't speak Arabic, unlike Richard Burton. He wasn't an Arabist. In fact, I don't think he could speak more than a few words. He pretended to be mad or ill and just mumbled whenever anyone spoke to him. And it didn't. He didn't manage to keep up the deception for terribly long, because when they were up in the Atlas Mountains, which they had to cross to get to Taradant, he he was captured by a local warlord and held to ransom for three weeks. He managed to talk his way out, and wrote a book about it called Maghreb El Aqsa, the Far West, which Hugh McDermott described as the best travel book ever written. It is a wonderful book. I've read it a couple of times, and it's a marvelous story of a journey that failed to fulfill its ambitions on almost every level you can imagine. So he completely broke the mold of 19th century travel writing, where the Englishman sallies forth and conquers everything that he comes across. Robert turned it on its head and wrote about a journey of failure, but in a very amusing and very colourful way. In 1906, they finally had to sell Gartmore. He and Gabriella sold Gartmore. They just couldn't keep it on any longer. And it broke his heart, but it did free him up to continue writing and traveling, which he continued to do. And he then moved to partly, he spent time partly in London for the remaining 30 years, 1906. So the remaining 30 years, part of the time in London, part of the time at Ardagh, the little house on the Clyde. He wasn't politically very active. He signed up during the war, got a commission from the War Department to go out to South America to buy horses, which, given that their life expectancy at the front in the First World War was about 3 weeks, seems a strange thing for him to have done, because he was a tremendous horse lover and a superb horseman. But I think it was I think he felt that something had to be, he had to make a contribution to the war effort, and that if the horses were to be killed, at least he could ensure that they were transported to the front in good conditions. That was kind of how he justified it to himself. So in 90, yes, so that was the First World War. He wasn't very active during the 20s, and when the Labour Party dropped Home Rule in the mid-20s, I think he'd become very disenchanted with it by that stage anyway, because it had become a much bigger organisation than he liked to be involved in. I mean, he wasn't a team player, Robert, by any stretch of the imagination. And I think the final nail in the coffin for him was, as he saw it, the party's betrayal of Scotland. So at that point, really, he was approaching he was in his late 70s, mid to late 70s, and he turned to the nationalist cause. And in 1928, he chaired the first meeting of the National Party of Scotland. And you can see from left to right the Duke of Montrose, Compton Mackenzie, Robert, Hugh McDermott, John McCormick, and James Valentine, all of whom had differing roles going forward in the nationalist movement. I mean, Robert. This was, so we're talking about 1928. He was nationalism at that time, of course, was starting to have a very bad name, particularly with what was going on in Germany. And I mean, Robert, in modern parlance, was not, I mean, he certainly wasn't a blood and soil nationalist of any description. He was, I think, what we would call today a civic nationalist. And he believed that the only way that Scotland's terrible, and I mean, they were still terrible social ills at that time, could be ameliorated was by a parliament sitting in Edinburgh run by Scots for Scots. And that was his honest belief. This is him speaking at Elderslie at a Bannockburn day, and I think that the Duke of Montrose is the one with the kilt sitting just to his left. They were both Grahams. They were kinsmen. He died on a final trip to Buenos Aires in 1936. He'd gone out to see the birthplace of his great friend, the writer W.H. Hudson, who'd been born in Argentina, and they developed a friendship in London, and they had South America in common, and became very close friends. And he went by that stage. Hudson had died, and Robert went to Buenos Aires on a trip to to go to Hudson's birthplace. He caught influenza, and died in the hotel in Buenos Aires. Uh, and his body was taken home on the ship on which he'd actually booked his own passage home. But he lay almost in state in a theater, in Buenos Aires, and the president and ministers of the republic came to see his body and pay their respects. And he was admired in Argentina, and still is to this day, primarily for having caught the gaucho way of life right at the cusp, at the very end of their ancient way of life, and just before mechanization and enclosure and communications came in and changed their way of life forever. And then, of course, he wrote about it. I mean, 20 years after the event, but he did write about it. And he was great. He is greatly admired in Argentina for having done that. I mean, by people like Borges and other great Argentine writers admired Robert's writing about that aspect of Argentine life. His body was taken down to the docks, and the procession was preceded by the two horses of his second biographer, Aimé Cefali, the Swiss equestrian who had done the extraordinary journey from Buenos Aires to Washington over a 3-year period in between 1925 and 1928. And those two horses had done that absolutely amazing. Still, I think probably the greatest equestrian journey of all time, had done that journey with him. And Robert had taken out with him a bag of oats for them, which he had been able to give to them before he died. Mancha and Gatto. So here's a little clip of his funeral. So there he is, buried beside Gabriella in the ruined prairie on Inchmahome. And you can see there that his brand mark is there instead of a cross, a Christian symbol. He has his brand mark. Um, so why isn't he better known? Why don't we know more about him? I mean, I don't think he could any more exist in the 21st century than one could make him up, really. And I think perhaps with the coming so soon after his death of the Second World War and the austerity that ensued once peace had reigned again, there really wasn't any room in the national consciousness for someone quite so flamboyant. I mean, he is so multifaceted. He's so contradictory in so many ways, and he's very difficult to pigeonhole. And we live in a society where we like things black and white. We like to be able to put labels on people. He's impossible to categorize, really. He was a writer. He was a politician. He was a horseman. Yes, he was all those things, but he was also a load of other things as well. And certainly by the time I came back to live in Scotland, having been brought up here and then spent 20 years in London, I came back in the 1990s. I mean, he was obscure at best, if not sort of totally overlooked. But his legacy is there. I mean, Parliament restored to Edinburgh, militant trade unionism, Party of Labour, free education, 8-hour working day, decent living standards, um, Irish Home Rule, um, formation of the Scottish National Party, a vigorous independence movement, vote for women, recognition of the rights of animals, foundation of national parks. I mean, I think he was probably a sort of proto-Green, really. Um, all of these things bear his fingerprints, and yet we still don't really know. He's not nearly as widely known as he should have been. Above Gabriella's grave, he put a plaque on Inchmahome, which reads, "In memory of Gabriella Cunninghame Graham of Gartmore, died at Andé in France on the Spanish border, 8th of September 1906, aged 45. Los muertos abren los ojos a los que viven. The dead open the eyes of the living." And I think that's a fitting note on which to end. So thank you very much for your kind attention this evening.